I'm going to explain the meaning of what these words are, the terminology I use, that perhaps people don't understand what these words mean. So the first one we go off is Ammonite Zones. Well, throughout the Kimmeridge clay, I think the Kimmeridge clay is divided into 13 Ammonite zones. And really, when we split it down to one zone, it really means that type of ammonite, that species of ammonite we find at that level. And often it dies out as we go through time. So that really is a technical way of describing where the ammonites are and where we find them. So if we find say from the Kimmeridge clay in Kimmeridge Bay, an Ortitiodorensis zone ammonite, and which is Alica stephanus, we can go to Russia and we can see the same ammonite. So we can work out what zones are even when we go laterally for huge distances. Second word, what's this? Anoxia, Anoxic. Okay, so that really means lack of oxygen. So the sea floor, and certain times the level of that seawater, it may be stratified. In other words, up the top it's beautiful, tropical seas, lovely, and down the bottom, that little bottom strata of that water column could be anoxic. So in other words, organisms can't live in that oxygen deficient sort of zone. So that's what we call about anoxia and anoxic. Cervical vertebrae, well, we've all got those. They're from the neck. That means vertebra from the neck. Convergent evolution, well, that's really quite interesting in the fact that when you look at an ichthyosaur, okay, which is a marine reptile, in its basic shape, when we come into the age of mammals and we look at a dolphin, basically it's the same sort of shape. The reason being convergent evolution is the shape that's best suited to what it's feeding on or whatever and what environment it's living in. So that's convergent evolution really for me. Dentary, well, again, that's your lower jaw, okay. Dorsal vertebra from the back, from the midline of your back. Mass extinction event, well, that's really where we're probably in one now where lots and lots of species are going extinct through certain causes. Some of them can be volcanic or whatever, and at the moment it's actually us killing the species or eradicating them. So mass extinction is really where a lot of species go extinct. Fossiliferous, well, that means when I'm looking in rocks and they got fossils in there, fossiliferous rocks, so it contains fossils. Holotype, that's actually an animal or a fossil that is completely new to science. So when you find something completely new to science and someone describes it, they describe that as the holotype. In other words, that's the benchmark that when you find something similar, you refer back to the holotype to see if it's the sort of same. Okay. Maxilla, well, that's your top teeth. Okay. So your row of teeth at the back, the premaxilla, the ones right at the front. Okay. Metalliferous, well, in the Kimmeridge clay we get Pyrite, which is a metalliferous mineral. In other words, when you strike it, it gives off a spark. It contains sulfur, but it's an iron compound. Palaeontology, well, that's really the study of fossils. Okay, that's everything to do with collecting, finding fossils and everything. That whole science is paleontology. Predation, that's really where an animal, dead or alive, gets attacked and eaten. So it gets predator is the thing that's actually attacking it and eating it. So in the Kimmeridge clay, especially in the museum, we've got evidence of predation where you've got like a limb bone of a plesiosaur with huge great bite marks in. We call that a predation mark. It's not been eaten, but it's been predated, and so that bone's not been eaten because it would have passed through the gut and you wouldn't have found it, but it's been ripped apart, in other words, predated. Preparator. Well, that's really what I am in some ways. So when you find a fossil and it's in the unclean state, you might bring a slab in and you can't see what you really think's under the matrix, under the rock. You prepare it out. In other words, you clean it. And there's people that are actually employed solely in museums as a preparator. It's a very skilled job that actually doesn't get the credit that it's due in some way. So when an academic comes along and looks at it and studies it, he doesn't appreciate the fact that the amount of work that's gone into it to reveal what he's going to study and describe. Pyrite, pyritic, right, okay, well the Kimmeridge clay is riddled with pyrite. Now that's a result of actually anoxic sort of environment. So in other words, you get these sulfide producing bacteria that really give off these horrible, in point of fact, if you go somewhere like Poole Harbour to describe it, drive your hand into that muddy sand, it stinks of sulphur. It's exactly the sort of same, this highly anoxic, horrible stuff. And it forms pyrite. And we get masses and masses of pyrite, and it's the bane of our lives in some way, because all the fossil bones we get and the fish, the basic mineralization, or the mass of it, is actually pyrite, which is an unstable mineral, which we have to keep all our fossils, Pyritic fossils, in an environment, humidity controlled. So we keep it down to about 40%, if not lower if we can, to stop that pyrite decay, because it's brought about by humidity. And what happens is the sulfuric acid that's contained within the pyrite leaches out, and it actually self-digests itself. So a large bone that you could beat someone around the head with and, you know, knock them out, ends up through time as a white mass of fluff and horrible smelly debris. So that's really what that's. Scapula, well, again, that's shoulder blade. That's a sort of sexual dimorphism. So that's really where you can tell the difference between the sexes. And sexual dimorphism in ammonites was, up until the 1980s, not looked at. In other words, could you tell the females from the male? And a very talented paleontologist actually worked that out, and I think the whole of the scientific establishment agree with his sort of findings. So we see dimorphism in ammonites, especially in the Kimmeridge clay, and throughout the whole of the Jurassic suite of rocks. Strata, well, that's the suite of rocks you're looking at. So the whole of the strata, that's all the rocks that are all built up through sort of time. Trace fossil, well, that's actually quite interesting, because if you've got this muddy substrate, then organisms like crustaceans burrow through this to feed on the organic material, and they might leave a hole that then collapses in through time, and it leaves that trace, that sinuous trace where it's been burrowing through. We get all sorts of things like little tiny shrimps that might have died, and it just, so that collapses in and leaves the shape of a sort of a shrimp. So trace fossils are really interesting, and there's certain names for different trace fossils. It's quite a sort of technical thing.